There is a version of you that says things you immediately regret. That version fires back before thinking. It raises its voice when it should stay calm. It goes cold when it should stay open. It says the one sentence that does the most damage and then spends days wishing it could take it back. And what is devastating about that version of you is that it does not feel like a choice. It feels automatic. It feels like the only thing that was possible in that moment. Like you had no say in what came out. But here is the truth. You did have a say. You just did not know how to use it. There is another version of you, one that takes the same provocation, the same frustration, the same sting of criticism or rejection, and instead of exploding or collapsing, pauses, breathes, thinks, and then speaks from a place of clarity instead of chaos. That version of you does not just survive difficult moments, it commands them. It earns respect in them. It builds trust through them, even when everything around is tense and charged and difficult. The distance between those two versions of you is not talent. It is not personality. It is not something you either have or you do not. It is a skill, a trainable, learnable, deeply human skill called emotional intelligence. And more specifically, it is the ability to stop reacting and start responding. This is what you are about to learn. Not the surface-level version. Not the feel-good advice that tells you to just breathe and count to 10. What you are going to learn here is the full psychology of what happens inside you when emotion surges, why your brain does what it does, where your triggers actually come from, and exactly how to build the internal architecture that allows you to show up as the version of yourself you actually want to be. In every situation, with every person, even the most difficult ones. This is not a short journey, but it is the most important one you will ever take. Chapter 1. The two versions of you. Every single person alive is carrying two versions of themselves into every room they walk into. Every conversation, every disagreement, every high-stakes moment, every quiet tension that simmers beneath the surface of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The first version is reactive. It operates from the gut. It moves at the speed of emotion. When something feels threatening, it strikes. When something feels painful, it retreats. When something feels overwhelming, it shuts down. This version of you has been running on autopilot for most of your life. It learned its patterns early, before you were old enough to choose them, and it has been executing them ever since with remarkable consistency. It does not stop to ask whether its response is helpful. It does not consider consequences. It does not think about the relationship, the context, or what you actually want from the situation. It simply reacts. And then it hands you the aftermath to clean up. The second version is responsive. It also feels everything the first version feels. Do not mistake being emotionally intelligent for being emotionally flat. This version does not numb itself. It does not suppress. It does not pretend the anger is not there, or that the hurt is not real. What it does differently is it creates a gap. A small but supremely powerful gap between feeling the emotion and acting on it. In that gap lives everything. Clarity, choice, wisdom, the ability to say what you actually mean instead of what the emotion is demanding you say in the heat of the moment. The question is not which version exists inside you. Both do. The question is which one you have trained. Most people spend their entire lives not realizing that this is even a choice. They assume the reactive version is just who they are. They say things like, "I am an emotional person," or "I have a short temper," or "I just cannot help it when I get triggered." And they say these things not as excuses, but as genuine beliefs, as if they were born this way, and this is simply the fixed architecture of their inner world. But that belief is not just inaccurate. It is the single most limiting belief a person can carry about themselves. Because the moment you accept that you cannot help how you react, you surrender your most powerful human capacity, which is the capacity to choose. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote something that has echoed through the decades since and will continue to echo for as long as human beings struggle with this question. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space, that is what emotional intelligence is built inside. And you can learn to find it. You can learn to widen it. You can learn to live inside it so consistently that the reactive version of you becomes the exception rather than the rule. Think about the last time you reacted in a way you regretted. Not the facts of the situation, but the feeling right after. That tightening in your chest. That voice in your head that said, "Why did I say that?" That sick awareness that something has now shifted in the relationship and you are the one who shifted it in the wrong direction. That moment of regret is incredibly important because it tells you something. It tells you that somewhere inside you there is a standard. There is a version of yourself that you know you are capable of being. And the distance between who you were in that moment and who you know you can be is the exact distance this work is designed to close. The reactive version of you is not your enemy. It is a survival mechanism. It developed for a reason. It kept you safe, or at least what your nervous system interpreted as safe, in moments when you were younger, more vulnerable, and had fewer tools. The problem is, it never got the update. It is still running the same operating system it was running when you were a child, navigating an environment you had no control over. And now you are an adult, in a world that requires something more sophisticated, something more intentional, something more powerful. The responsive version of you is not some perfect, emotionless robot. It is warm. It is real. It is deeply human. It cries when it needs to. It gets angry when something is genuinely unjust. It feels joy and grief and fear and love with full intensity. But it does not let those feelings run the show without permission. It invites them in, listens to what they are trying to say, and then decides, consciously and deliberately, how to act on the information they are providing. That is the version of you that we are going to build. And we are going to build it from the ground up, starting with understanding exactly what is happening inside you when you react, and why it feels so impossible to stop. Chapter 2. What reacting really is. To stop doing something, you first have to understand it. Not just on the surface, not just that it happens, but where it comes from, why it happens with such speed, and why it feels so completely out of your control even when part of you is watching yourself do it and wishing you could stop. Reacting, in the emotional sense, is not a character flaw. It is biology. It is the result of systems in your brain and body that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years for a purpose that was extraordinarily useful in one world and extraordinarily costly in another. Here is what is actually happening when you react. Your brain has a part of it called the amygdala. It sits deep in the center of your brain, in the region neuroscientists call the limbic system, and its entire job is to scan your environment for threat all day, every second. It never takes a break. It never clocks out. It is constantly reading the signals coming in from your senses, from your memories, from the tone of someone's voice or the expression on their face, and it is making one continuous, rapid, unconscious assessment. Is this safe or is this dangerous? When the amygdala decides that something is dangerous, it does not send a polite memo to your rational mind asking for a second opinion. It fires. Immediately, it sends a signal to your body to mobilize, and within milliseconds, hormones flood your system. Cortisol, adrenaline, your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your breathing changes. Your attention narrows to a laser focus on the perceived threat. And your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning, long-term thinking, empathy, and impulse control, gets effectively taken offline. Not completely, but significantly. Its resources are redirected. Because in a survival situation, you do not need nuance, you need speed. This is the response that kept your ancestors alive on the African savanna when a predator appeared at the edge of the clearing. The amygdala saw the threat, the body mobilized, and there was no time to sit and rationally consider the best response. You ran, you fought, or you froze. And whichever one you did, it was the right call, because it kept you breathing. The problem is that your amygdala does not know the difference between a lion and a harsh email from your boss. It does not distinguish between physical danger and social threat. It cannot tell the difference between someone genuinely trying to harm you and someone who said something thoughtless at dinner. What it can do is detect anything that feels like a threat. And what feels like a threat is built almost entirely on your personal history, your past experiences, your old wounds, the patterns your nervous system learned a long time ago about what to be afraid of. This is why you can have two people in the exact same room, hearing the exact same words from the exact same person, and one of them barely registers it while the other feels a surge of anger or hurt, so intense it is physically uncomfortable. It is not because one of them is oversensitive and the other is healthy. It is because their amygdalas have been calibrated differently. The threats they were trained to detect are different, and the body's alarm system goes off accordingly. When psychologist Daniel Goleman wrote about this phenomenon, he called it the amygdala hijack. That phrase is perfect, because that is exactly what it feels like something has taken control of your body and your mouth before your mind had a chance to weigh in, like you are watching yourself react from the outside, aware that this is not quite right, but utterly unable to stop it in the moment. And this is the critical thing to understand about reacting. It is not a choice. Not in the moment, it is happening. When you have not built the tools to intervene, it is an automatic, conditioned, neurological response that has been reinforced over years and years of repetition. Every time you reacted in a certain way to a certain kind of trigger, you strengthened the neural pathway that produces that reaction. You made it faster and more efficient. You essentially trained your brain to react even more automatically the next time. This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Because here is what the science also tells us. The brain is plastic. It changes with experience. The neural pathways that produce reactive behavior were built through repetition, which means they can be rebuilt through different kinds of repetition. The amygdala can be trained to pause before firing when it is given the right signals consistently enough. The prefrontal cortex can be strengthened to stay online even in the presence of emotional intensity. The gap between stimulus and response can be widened. Not by willpower alone, not by telling yourself to calm down in the middle of an emotional surge, which almost never works, but by building the internal architecture that creates a different default. That is what this entire process is designed to do. But before we build anything new, we have to go one layer deeper. Because understanding that reacting is biological is necessary, but it is not complete. Because not everyone reacts to the same things. The content of your reactions, what sets you off, how intensely, and in which direction, is not purely biological. It is deeply personal. It is shaped by your story. And to change it, you have to understand where it came from. Chapter 3. The Neuroscience of the Hijack. Let's go even further inside the brain. Because the more precisely you understand what is happening in there, the more power you have over it. Knowledge of the mechanism is one of the most powerful tools you have for changing the mechanism. Your brain has 3 broad layers, each representing a different stage of evolutionary development. The outermost layer, the neocortex, is the newest. It handles everything we associate with higher human thinking: language, planning, abstract reasoning, empathy, creativity, moral judgment. The prefrontal cortex, the part that sits just behind your forehead, is the crown jewel of this layer. It is what makes you distinctly human. It is what allows you to think about the future, to imagine how another person is feeling, to override an impulse for a greater long-term gain. Beneath the neocortex is the limbic system. This is older, much older. It handles emotion, memory, and motivation. The amygdala lives here. So does the hippocampus, which is responsible for forming and storing long-term memories. These 2 structures, the amygdala and the hippocampus, work together constantly, often below the level of your conscious awareness, tagging experiences with emotional significance and storing them for future reference. When something happens to you that carries strong emotion, the amygdala marks it. It says, "Remember this," and the hippocampus files it away. Later, when something in your environment resembles that past experience, the amygdala recognizes the pattern and responds accordingly, often before you even consciously register what you are responding to. This is why you can walk into a room that smells like your childhood home and feel a wave of emotion before you can even identify what you are feeling. It is why the tone of a certain person's voice can make your whole body tense up before their words have even landed. It is why criticism in a particular form can hit you with an intensity that seems out of proportion to the actual words said. Your amygdala is not responding to what is happening now. It is responding to what it remembers. It is pattern matching. It is saying, "This feels like that thing from before, the one that hurt, the one that scared you, the one that was dangerous." And it fires. Here is what happens in the body when the amygdala fires. The hypothalamus receives the signal and immediately activates the sympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for your fight flight, or freeze response. Adrenaline is released. Your heart pumps harder, pushing more blood to your muscles. Your pupils dilate. Your digestion slows. Your palms may sweat. Your jaw may tighten. Your breathing becomes shallow and fast. Every single one of these changes is designed to prepare your body for action, for physical action, for running or fighting or becoming as still as possible. The problem is that none of these physiological changes are helpful when the threat is not physical, when the threat is a conversation you are having at the kitchen table, or a message you just received on your phone, or a meeting at work where someone challenged something you said. Your body is preparing for a fight that cannot be won with speed and muscle. And the resources that have been diverted away from your prefrontal cortex, those are exactly the resources you need for the kind of response the situation actually requires. The ability to listen, to empathize, to think about what you actually want to say, to consider the other person's perspective, to choose your words carefully. This is the hijack. Your most sophisticated mental equipment gets knocked offline at the exact moment you need it most. And what makes this even more complex is that the intensity of the hijack is not constant. It varies based on several factors. How depleted you already are plays an enormous role. When you are tired, hungry, stressed about something unrelated, or emotionally already stretched thin, your threshold drops dramatically. Things that would not bother you on a good day can send you into a full reactive spiral on a difficult one. This is why conversations that happen late at night or during high-stress periods almost always go worse than the same conversations would have gone at another time. It is not the subject of the conversation that changes. It is the state of your nervous system going into it. The content of what you perceive as threatening also matters. Some people have amygdalas that are particularly sensitive to rejection. Others are most reactive to criticism. Others to feeling controlled. Others to being ignored or dismissed. This sensitivity is not random. It was calibrated by your history, by the things that hurt you most when you were young and did not have the capacity to process them fully. And because they were not fully processed, they are still live, still capable of producing that same surge of threat response when the right trigger comes along, even decades later. There is also something called emotional flooding. When the amygdala fires and the body goes into fight or flight, the physiological changes that occur can become so intense that the ability to reason is not just impaired, but nearly absent. Research by relationship psychologist John Gottman found that when a person's heart rate climbs above a certain threshold during conflict, their capacity for constructive communication essentially collapses. They become physiologically flooded. And in that state, no amount of trying harder or willing yourself to be calmer is going to work, because the body is running a program that is designed to override your voluntary control. This is why the common advice to just think before you speak is so deeply insufficient. Thinking requires a functioning prefrontal cortex. And if you are flooded, your prefrontal cortex is not available for that kind of thinking. The real work of emotional intelligence happens before the flood. It happens in the training, in the daily practices, in the gradual rewiring of your nervous system that makes you less likely to flood in the first place, and that gives you more access to your rational mind even when you do. Understanding this is not about giving yourself an excuse. It is about understanding the actual terrain. Because you cannot navigate terrain you do not understand. And you cannot build tools for a problem you have misdiagnosed. The problem is not that you are weak or undisciplined or emotionally immature. The problem is that your nervous system was trained in one kind of environment and is now operating in another. And it needs to be updated. Not by force, by intelligence. Chapter 4. What responding actually means. Now we come to the other side of the equation. Because if reacting is the automatic, the hijacked, the conditioned, then responding is something else entirely. And it is important to be precise about what responding actually is, because it is frequently misunderstood in ways that make people think it is either unattainable or, frankly, undesirable. Responding is not staying calm at all costs. It is not suppressing what you feel so that you appear composed. It is not swallowing your anger or your hurt and putting on a pleasant face while the emotion eats at you from the inside. That is not regulation. That is repression. And repression is not intelligence. It is a different kind of problem. Responding is not being passive. It is not letting people walk over you. It is not avoiding difficult conversations or refusing to assert yourself because you do not want to seem reactive. There is nothing emotionally intelligent about being a doormat. In fact, genuine emotional intelligence often requires harder, more direct conversations than most people are having, because it has the courage to have them clearly and without unnecessary damage. Responding is not the absence of emotion. It is, in fact, the full and honest presence of emotion, paired with the capacity to choose how you act on it. A person who is responding can feel deep anger and still speak without cruelty, can feel profound hurt and still stay in the room, can feel the urge to shut down and still choose to stay open. That is not suppression. That is something far more sophisticated. It is emotional maturity, and it is available to every human being who is willing to do the work to develop it. So what is responding precisely? Responding is the practice of creating a conscious gap between what you feel and what you do. It is the act of noticing that an emotion has been triggered, acknowledging what that emotion is and what information it is trying to give you, and then making an intentional choice about how to act, rather than letting the emotion make that choice for you. In practical terms, it looks like pausing, but not the kind of pause that feels like white-knuckling through the urge to react. The kind of pause that comes from a nervous system that has been trained to tolerate emotional intensity without immediately discharging it. Viktor Frankl spoke of that space between stimulus and response. Every tool, every practice, every concept in this entire video is designed to help you find that space and live in it. Because in that space, something remarkable becomes possible. You can ask yourself, what is actually happening here? Not what does it feel like is happening, but what is actually happening. You can ask, what do I actually want from this situation? Not what does the part of me that is hurt or scared or angry want, but what do I genuinely want for this relationship, this conversation, this moment? And you can ask, what is the most effective thing I can do right now to move toward that? Those three questions cannot be asked or answered from inside a reactive state. They require a mind that has enough space to think, and they lead to something that pure reaction never can produce, which is a response that actually serves you. Think about what happens when you respond rather than react in a real conflict. Imagine your partner says something that stings. In reactive mode, you snap back. They feel attacked. They snap back harder. You feel more hurt. You say something worse. They withdraw or escalate. And now you are not having the conversation you needed to have. You are in a completely different, far more damaging conversation that neither of you wanted to be in. The original thing that needed to be addressed, the real feeling that was underneath that first sting, never gets heard. Instead, it gets buried under layers of defensive words and wounded pride. Now imagine the same moment, but you catch the sting. You notice the surge in your body. You do not act on it immediately. You take a breath. You let the wave pass just slightly. And you say, I want to talk about this, but I need a second to think about how I want to say it. Or even simpler, that hit me harder than I expected. Can we slow down? The entire trajectory of the conversation changes. Not because you hid what you were feeling, not because you became less honest, but because you chose when and how to express it. And that choice protected both of you. This is what responding makes possible. Not better-looking reactions, genuinely different outcomes, different relationships, a different quality of life. There is an important distinction to make here about the time it takes. Responding does sometimes require slowing down. Not always. With practice, the gap becomes faster. It becomes almost instantaneous. Because your nervous system has been so consistently rewired that the pause happens automatically, at a level below conscious effort. But in the beginning, the learning phase, slowing down, is not a weakness. It is the mechanism. Saying, I need a moment, is not avoiding the conversation. It is protecting it. The other thing to understand about responding is that it includes your body. Most people think of emotional regulation as something that happens in the mind, a mental process of talking yourself out of a reaction. But the body is where emotion lives. The surge of adrenaline, the tight chest, the racing heart. These are not just symptoms of emotion. They are the emotion, at least part of it. And you cannot think your way out of a physiological state. You have to work with the body as much as the mind, which is why breath, physical movement, grounding, these are not just relaxation techniques. They are direct interventions in the neurobiology of the reaction. They speak the language the body understands. Responding is a full system process, mind, body, and habit. And it begins at the root, which is self-awareness. Chapter 5. Self-awareness. The foundation of everything. You cannot change what you cannot see. This is one of those statements that sounds obvious the first time you hear it. But the more you sit with it, the more you realize how radical its implications actually are. Because if it is true, and it is, then the entire project of emotional intelligence begins not with learning techniques for staying calm or strategies for difficult conversations, but with something far more fundamental, the ability to see yourself clearly, to observe your own inner world with honesty, precision, and without the kind of defensiveness that causes most people to look away from the very things they most need to see. Self-awareness, in the context of emotional intelligence, means knowing what you are feeling, when you are feeling it, understanding why those feelings arise, recognizing how they are influencing your behavior, and seeing the patterns that repeat across your emotional life. It is not a one-time insight. It is an ongoing practice, a continuous conversation between you and your inner world that deepens the more consistently you show up for it. Most people have a far lower level of emotional self-awareness than they realize. This is not a criticism. It is a feature of the way most of us grew up. In most households, in most schools, in most cultural environments, emotions are not something we are taught to examine. They are something we are taught to manage in the most surface-level sense of the word. We are taught to control ourselves, meaning do not cry in public, do not show anger, do not be too sensitive. But we are almost never taught to understand ourselves, to trace an emotion back to its source, to ask why this and why now, to notice the difference between what an emotion feels like and what it actually is. The result is that most people walk around carrying an enormous amount of emotional experience that they have never actually processed. They feel things intensely, regularly, often in confusing and contradictory ways. But they cannot name what they are feeling with precision. They cannot locate where in their body the feeling lives. They cannot explain what triggered it, or trace it back to the belief, or the wound, or the unmet need that is actually generating it. They just feel it. And then they either act on it or suppress it, because those are the only two tools they have. Self-awareness gives you a third option. It gives you the ability to witness, to stand inside your experience and observe it at the same time. To be the one who is feeling the frustration and simultaneously the one who is noticing that frustration is present, getting curious about it rather than being controlled by it. This witnessing capacity is what creates the gap between stimulus and response that we talked about in the last chapter. You cannot pause what you cannot see. If you are not aware that an emotion has arisen, you are not in a position to make a choice about how to act on it. The reaction simply happens because there was no moment of awareness in which choice became possible. But the moment you can say to yourself, I notice I'm getting angry, or I feel something tightening in my chest, or there is an urge in me right now to say something sharp, in that moment, you are no longer purely inside the reaction. You are observing it. And observation is the beginning of choice. How do you develop self-awareness? It begins with slowing down, which in the modern world requires a genuine countercultural commitment. Because everything around you is designed to speed you up, to keep your attention moving constantly from one stimulus to the next, never pausing long enough to look inward. The first and most powerful practice for building self-awareness is reflection. Specifically, the daily habit of sitting with your emotional experience and examining it honestly. Journaling is one of the most effective tools ever identified for this purpose. Not journaling as a diary of events, but journaling as an act of emotional excavation. At the end of a day, or at any moment when something has stirred inside you, you write. Not necessarily in polished sentences, just an honest account of what you felt, when you felt it, what triggered it, and what that trigger might be pointing to. Over time, patterns emerge. You start to notice that certain kinds of comments consistently produce a certain reaction, that certain environments deplete your emotional reserves in specific ways, that your most reactive moments tend to cluster around particular themes, particular fears, particular old stories about yourself that have never been fully examined. Those patterns are gold. Because once you can see a pattern, you can work with it. You can anticipate it. You can put structures in place that help you navigate it more skillfully, and eventually you can trace it back to where it started. And doing that is when the real transformation becomes possible. Mindfulness is another extraordinarily powerful tool for self-awareness. Not in the abstract, New Age sense, but in the precise, psychological sense of training your attention to stay in the present moment and to observe what is arising without immediately judging or acting on it. When you practice mindfulness consistently, whether through formal meditation or through simpler practices of present moment attention throughout the day, you gradually build what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking, to observe your emotional states with something like detachment, without those states losing their authenticity. You feel the anger, but you also note that anger is present, as if from a slight distance. And in that slight distance, everything changes. Emotional check-ins throughout the day are another simple but deeply effective practice. Several times a day, you pause, even for 30 seconds, and you ask yourself a genuine question. What am I feeling right now? Not what should I be feeling, or what am I thinking, but what is actually present emotionally in this moment. You name it as precisely as you can, not just bad or fine, but something more specific. Am I anxious, frustrated, tired, resentful, lonely, excited? The act of naming an emotion with precision does something neurologically remarkable. Research has found that when you accurately label an emotion, activity in the amygdala actually decreases. The act of naming a feeling with words engages the prefrontal cortex and reduces the intensity of the emotional surge. You literally calm your brain by naming what you feel. This is called affect labeling, and it is not a soft skill. It is a neurobiological intervention. It is one of the most accessible tools you have for beginning to regulate yourself in real time. But it only works if your self-awareness is developed enough to actually identify what you are feeling in the first place. Beyond the practices, self-awareness also requires something less concrete and more uncomfortable, which is the willingness to receive honest feedback from the people in your life. Because there are things about how you come across, about the patterns in your behavior, about the ways your emotional reactions land on others, that you simply cannot see from the inside. You have blind spots. Every human being does. And those blind spots are often exactly the places where your reactive patterns cause the most damage, precisely because you cannot see them happening. This is where trusted relationships become one of the most powerful tools for self-development, not just therapy, though therapy is enormously valuable for this, but any relationship where honesty is safe, where someone can tell you that you get defensive when you receive criticism, or that you go very quiet in a way that feels punishing to others when you are hurt, or that your tone changes in a way that people find intimidating when you are stressed. These are not comfortable things to hear, but they are priceless, because they show you the parts of your emotional landscape that you cannot navigate by yourself, simply because you cannot see them. Self-awareness is not a destination. It is a discipline, and like all disciplines, it compounds over time. The longer you practice it, the more access you have to your own interior world. The more precisely you can see what is happening inside you, the more choice you have about what to do with it. And the more choice you have, the more you become the author of your own responses rather than the passenger in your own reactions. Everything else in this journey, the trigger work, the nervous system tools, the empathy practices, the real-life applications, all of it is built on this foundation. Without self-awareness, the best techniques in the world are like sophisticated instruments in the hands of someone who has never learned to play. They do not make music. They make noise. With self-awareness, even the simplest tools become transformative, because you are finally awake to what you are working with. And once you are awake, you can begin to change things that have felt unchangeable for your entire life. Chapter 6. Mapping your emotional triggers. There is a very specific feeling that comes right before a reaction. A tightening somewhere in the body. A heat that rises. A sudden narrowing of attention, as if the rest of the world has gone slightly out of focus, and the one thing in front of you has become very loud, very present, very sharp. Most people, when they feel that feeling, go straight through it and into the reaction without ever stopping to ask what just happened, without ever getting curious about the split second before the explosion or the withdrawal or the cold silence. But that split second is where everything important lives. And learning to slow it down, to examine it, to map it with precision, is one of the most transformative practices available to any human being serious about emotional intelligence. A trigger is not the thing that made you react. That is a common misunderstanding, and it costs people enormously because it keeps them focused on the wrong problem. The person who said the cutting thing, the situation that felt unfair, the comment that landed like an accusation. None of these are the trigger. They are the stimulus. The trigger is what lives inside you. The wound or the fear or the unmet need or the old story that was touched by that stimulus. The outside event is just the key. The trigger is the lock. And the lock was installed long before today. Think about the kinds of things that reliably set you off. Not everything bothers you equally. A particular tone of voice might do it. Being ignored or dismissed might do it. Being criticized in front of others. Feeling controlled. Not being taken seriously. Having your loyalty questioned. Feeling like you are being left out. Being compared unfavorably to someone else. Having your work or your effort go unacknowledged. Each of these rings true for some people and leaves others completely unmoved. The ones that ring true for you are your triggers. And they are personal, specific, and deeply rooted in your history. This is the thing about triggers that most people never examine. They did not appear out of nowhere. They were created. At some point in your past, usually in your early years when you were most vulnerable and least equipped to process difficult experiences, something happened that your nervous system registered as dangerous. Not necessarily physically dangerous, emotionally dangerous. And your brain, doing exactly what it was designed to do, filed that experience away with a flag on it, a warning. If something like this happens again, mobilize, protect yourself. Do not let this happen again. The problem is that the flag does not expire, and the system that activates when the flag is raised is not very good at distinguishing between then and now. So when something in your present life resembles the original wound, even loosely, even partially, the alarm fires as though the original threat is back. The adult sitting in a meeting who feels a surge of shame when their idea is dismissed is not actually responding to that meeting. They are responding to every classroom moment in childhood when they raised their hand and were made to feel foolish. The partner who goes completely cold and withdraws when they feel criticized is not really responding to what was just said. They are responding to years of being in an environment where criticism was the precursor to something worse. The employee who becomes instantly defensive when their manager questions their work is not responding to the question. They are responding to a lifetime of having their worth feel conditional on their performance. None of these people are overreacting, not in the sense of being irrational. They are responding with the emotional logic of their own history, which makes perfect sense. But it is causing them enormous damage in the present, because the people around them are not the people from their past. The situations are not the same, and the reactions that feel self-protective are, in fact, self-limiting. Mapping your triggers means doing the work of going back. Not in a way that requires years of therapy, though therapy is invaluable for this, but in a way that requires honesty and willingness to sit with uncomfortable questions. The next time you react strongly to something, after the moment has passed, and you are in a calmer state, you ask yourself a sequence of questions. What was the feeling that arose? And where did I feel it in my body? What story did my mind immediately tell me about what was happening? What did that story remind me of? When have I felt this particular flavor of hurt or threat or anger before? How far back does it go? That last question is often the most revealing. Because when you trace a strong emotional reaction all the way back to its origin, something important shifts. You begin to see the trigger not as evidence of a flaw in your character, but as evidence of an experience you had, something that happened to you, something that shaped you in ways you did not choose. And that shift, from shame about your reactions to curiosity about their origins, is one of the most liberating shifts possible in the entire journey of emotional development. Once you have mapped a trigger, you have something you did not have before: anticipation. You know that certain kinds of interactions are going to activate this part of you. You know that when you walk into a particular kind of conversation, or when you are with a particular kind of person, or when you are in a certain kind of situation, the alarm is likely to fire. And knowing that in advance means you can prepare, you can set an intention, you can put structures in place. You can remind yourself, before you even enter the situation, that what you are about to feel is not a verdict on what is happening right now. It is information about what happened then. This does not make the feeling disappear. Triggers, once they are formed, tend to stay sensitive for a long time, even with significant work. But the goal is not to eliminate the feeling. The goal is to build enough awareness around it that when it fires, you can say, there it is, rather than simply becoming it. That tiny bit of distance, that almost imperceptibly small gap between the feeling and the identification of the feeling, is all you need to make a different choice than the one you made before. And over time, with that practice repeated again and again, the reaction begins to lose its automaticity. It becomes something you can see coming, something you can work with, something you own, rather than something that owns you. Chapter 7. The Biology of Calm. Your nervous system is on your side. Here is something that most people never understand about the human nervous system. It is not just a system for generating stress. It is also a system for generating calm. In fact, your body has a built-in mechanism, a physiological counterbalance to the fight or flight response, and it is just as powerful as the stress response, though almost nobody knows how to use it deliberately. When you learn to activate it, you gain access to a tool for emotional regulation that is more immediate, more reliable, and more biologically profound than any mental technique ever devised. The nervous system is divided into two major branches: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. You have already learned what the sympathetic system does. It is the accelerator. It powers up the body for action in the presence of perceived threat. Heart rate up, breathing fast and shallow, muscles tensed, digestion paused, attention narrowed. This is the system that fires during the amygdala hijack. This is what you feel when a conversation is going sideways and your body starts running a program designed for physical survival. The parasympathetic nervous system is the brake. When it activates, it does essentially the opposite. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, and becomes more regular. Muscles begin to release their tension. Digestion resumes. The mind widens its focus. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain you need for clear thinking, empathy, and good decision-making, comes back online. The body shifts from a state of readiness for threat into a state of readiness for connection, for reflection, for the kind of nuanced, thoughtful engagement that emotionally difficult situations actually require. The parasympathetic system has another name that is worth knowing. It is sometimes called the rest and digest system, as opposed to the fight or flight system. And its primary activator is something you already do approximately 22,000 times a day without thinking about it. Breathing. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. Your breath is the only function in your body that is both involuntary, meaning it happens automatically without your conscious control, and voluntary, meaning you can also choose to take over and direct it at any moment. And because your breathing is directly connected to your autonomic nervous system, the system that regulates your stress response, consciously changing your breath pattern sends an almost immediate signal to your brain that the threat has passed, that the body can downshift, that it is safe to bring the thinking mind back online. Specifically, it is the exhale that activates the parasympathetic response. When you make your exhale longer than your inhale, you directly stimulate the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the human body and the primary communication channel of the parasympathetic nervous system. The vagus nerve runs from the brain stem all the way down through the heart, the lungs, and the gut, which is why emotional states have such powerful physical sensations associated with them. When the vagus nerve receives the signal from a slow, extended exhale, it transmits calm throughout the entire body, from the heart rate to the gut to the thinking mind, in a matter of seconds. This is why the instruction to take a deep breath before you respond is not just a polite platitude. It is a direct biological intervention. But the key is in the exhale, not just the inhale. Breathing in deeply but then exhaling just as quickly does not activate the parasympathetic system the same way. The pattern that research consistently shows to be most effective is an inhale for roughly 4 counts and an exhale for roughly 6 to 8 counts. That extended exhale is the physiological signal that everything is safe, that the body can stand down from its emergency state. Beyond breathing, there are other ways to activate the parasympathetic nervous system that are worth understanding, because they give you more tools for those moments when simply breathing is not enough. Physical movement is one of them. Not intense, adrenaline-generating exercise, but gentle, deliberate movement. A slow walk, rolling the shoulders, unclenching the hands, consciously releasing the jaw, shaking out the arms. All of these send signals to the nervous system that interrupt the freeze or fight response and begin to shift the body's state. Cold water on the face or the wrists is another rapid intervention. The diving reflex, which is an ancient physiological mechanism shared by all mammals, is triggered by cold water on the face, and it dramatically slows the heart rate within seconds. It is uncomfortable in the moment, but extraordinarily effective for breaking through a state of emotional flooding when nothing else is accessible. Grounding practices, which involve deliberately bringing your attention to the physical sensations of your body in the present moment, are another highly effective tool. The simple act of feeling your feet flat on the floor, noticing the weight of your body in the chair, pressing your palms against a cool surface, or focusing on 5 things you can see right now, all of these interrupt the brain's tendency to spiral into threat-based thinking by anchoring your attention to sensory reality, to what is actually happening in the physical world right now, rather than the story the amygdala is telling you about what the situation means. What all of these tools have in common is that they work with the body rather than against it. They are not about using willpower to override what you are feeling. They are about communicating with your nervous system in its own language, the language of physiology, and giving it the signals it needs to shift states. And the remarkable thing about this is that once your body has shifted, once the parasympathetic system is engaged, and the physiological storm has begun to subside, the thoughts follow. The mental clarity that was unavailable at the height of the reaction begins to return. The empathy that was crowded out by the amygdala's alarm becomes accessible again. The prefrontal cortex comes back to work. The reason this matters so profoundly for the practice of responding rather than reacting is that you cannot think your way into a calm state from inside a stress response. But you can breathe your way there. You can move your way there. You can ground your way there. The body leads and the mind follows. And once the mind is back, once that thinking, empathizing, choosing part of you is online again, you are no longer at the mercy of the hijack. You are back in the driver's seat. And from there, a genuine response, one that reflects your values and your actual intentions, becomes possible again. Chapter 8. The pause, the most powerful moment you will ever own. If there is one skill at the center of everything we are discussing, one practice that sits at the intersection of neuroscience and emotional intelligence, and the most practical human psychology, it is the pause. Not the pause as a social nicety, not the pause as a performance of self-control, but the pause as a genuine, deliberate, biologically informed act of choosing your next moment rather than being dragged into it by the momentum of your emotional state. The pause is the space Viktor Frankl was describing. It is what lives between stimulus and response, and it is almost infinitely expandable. It can last a breath, a second, a minute, an hour, a day. The length of the pause is not as important as the quality of what happens inside it. Because the pause is not just an absence of action, it is a presence of awareness. It is the moment in which you shift from being inside the experience to also being the witness of it. And that shift changes everything. Most people, when they hear about the concept of pausing before reacting, imagine a kind of grinding halt, a laborious effort to stop themselves mid-motion, something that requires enormous willpower, and that probably still won't work in the heat of the moment. And if the pause were only that, a conscious braking mechanism, they would be right to be skeptical. Willpower is finite. It depletes under stress, exactly when you need it most. A pause that depends entirely on willpower is fragile, and fragile tools fail in high-stakes situations. But the pause we are talking about is not built on willpower. It is built on a trained nervous system, on a habit of awareness that has been cultivated over time until it becomes something close to automatic, a new default that runs beneath the level of effortful control. When you have consistently practiced the kind of self-awareness discussed in an earlier chapter, when you have learned to notice your emotional states with precision, when you have used breathing and grounding to develop a relationship with your parasympathetic nervous system, the pause begins to emerge organically. Not as something you force yourself to do, but as something your nervous system has learned to reach for, because it has experienced enough times that what comes after the pause is better than what comes without it. There is a physical sensation associated with a genuine pause that is worth describing, because once you know what to look for, you can begin to practice accessing it deliberately. It is the feeling of being slightly outside of the situation, even while you are still in it. Not detached, not cold, not indifferent to what is happening, but not entirely swept up in it either. It is the sensation of watching yourself, as if from a very small but meaningful distance, while still being fully present. Athletes sometimes describe something similar as being in the zone. Performers talk about it as the difference between being lost in the performance and being fully present in it. In emotional regulation, it is the feeling of being real and responding simultaneously, rather than just reacting. What does the pause actually look like in practice? It looks different depending on the situation and the person. In some moments, it is literally one slow breath before speaking, that single conscious inhale and extended exhale that shifts the nervous system just enough to bring more prefrontal cortex online. In other moments, it is an explicit, verbal request, saying, "I want to respond to this thoughtfully. Can I have a moment?" Or saying, "I hear you. I need a few minutes to think about how I want to respond." In more intense situations, it might mean excusing yourself from the room entirely, taking a brief walk, or agreeing to continue the conversation in an hour when both people have had time to regulate. None of these are avoidance. None of these are weakness or people-pleasing or conflict aversion. They are the most sophisticated thing a human being can do in a charged moment, which is to prioritize the quality of the response over the speed of it. In a culture that often values quick comebacks and immediate reactions and the appearance of having it all together in real time, deliberately slowing down can feel exposing. It can feel like a concession, but it is the opposite. The person who pauses is not the one who could not keep up. They are the one who understood that the stakes were high enough to take their time. Inside the pause, several things become possible that are not possible inside the reaction. You can ask yourself what you are actually feeling, not what you are performing, but what is genuinely present emotionally in this moment. You can ask whether your interpretation of the situation is the only possible one, or whether there might be another explanation for what was just said or done. You can ask what you actually want from this interaction, what outcome you are genuinely hoping for, and whether what you are about to say is going to move you toward that outcome or away from it. You can ask whether the intensity of what you are feeling is proportionate to what is actually happening right now, or whether the intensity suggests that an old trigger has been activated and you are partially responding to something that is not in the room. These questions cannot be asked in the middle of a reaction. The reactive state is too narrow, too fast, too certain of its own interpretation. The pause creates the space in which uncertainty becomes possible, and uncertainty is not weakness. Uncertainty is the precondition for learning, for listening, for changing your mind about what is happening, and therefore changing the entire direction of the interaction. One of the most powerful things about the pause is what it communicates to the other person, even if they are in a reactive state themselves. When one person in a conflict slows down, the nervous system of the other person is invited to slow down as well. This is not magic. It is neuroscience. Human beings are extraordinarily attuned to the physiological state of the people around them. We co-regulate each other's nervous systems constantly, often without realizing it. This is why being in the presence of a genuinely calm person when you are distressed tends to bring your own distress level down, even if they have not said a word. And it is why one person choosing the pause in a heated exchange is not just a personal act of self-regulation. It is a gift to the conversation itself. It changes the emotional temperature of the room, and it makes a better outcome possible for everyone in it. Chapter 9. Reframing. Changing what a situation means to you. Your emotions do not respond to reality. They respond to your interpretation of reality. This is one of the most important insights in all of psychology. And it is so fundamental to the experience of being human that it is worth saying again, very slowly. Your emotions do not respond to what is actually happening. They respond to the story your mind tells you about what is happening. And that story, that interpretation, is something you have far more influence over than most people ever realize. This is not to say that your feelings are not real. They are completely real. The pain is real. The anger is real. The fear is real. But the content of those feelings, how intense they are, how long they last, what they are demanding you do in response, all of this is shaped in substantial part by the meaning you have assigned to the event that triggered them. Change the meaning, and the emotional response changes with it. Not always instantly, and not through a simple act of positive thinking, but through a genuine, honest, psychologically rigorous process of examining your interpretation and asking whether it is the only possible one. This process is called reframing, and it is one of the most well-researched, most clinically validated, most consistently effective tools in the entire landscape of emotional regulation and psychological well-being. It comes from cognitive psychology, from the work of Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, from decades of research into how the stories we tell ourselves about events determine how we feel about those events and therefore how we behave in response to them. And it is not a soft tool. It is not positive thinking dressed up in academic language. It is a rigorous, honest, disciplined practice of examining the accuracy and the usefulness of your automatic interpretations. Here is how it works in practice. Something happens. Your boss asks to speak with you privately, and immediately a thought arises, automatic and fast. Barely even a thought, more like a flash of meaning. This is bad. I must have done something wrong. This is going to be criticism. And with that flash of meaning comes a wave of emotion, anxiety, dread, perhaps a surge of defensive anger. And all of that emotional content, the anxiety, The dread, the defensiveness, is not a response to your boss asking to speak with you. It is a response to the story you told yourself in the milliseconds after that happened. A story that you generated almost entirely from your own history, your own fears, your own past experiences of what it has meant when authority figures asked to speak with you. Now, is that story possible? Yes. Your boss might be about to criticize you. Is it the only possible explanation? Clearly not. Your boss might be about to offer you new responsibility, might want your opinion on a decision, might want to give you good news, might need to discuss something completely unrelated to your performance. The number of possible explanations for the event is very large, and the anxiety-generating one is only one of them. But because your nervous system generated it first, because it felt like the most probable explanation based on your history and your emotional wiring, it dominated. And the emotion that followed it felt like a response to reality rather than what it actually was, which was a response to a story about reality. Reframing does not mean telling yourself it is all fine when you genuinely do not know. It does not mean manufacturing false optimism or dismissing the anxious interpretation entirely. It means widening the frame. It means asking what else might be true. It means consciously acknowledging that the meaning you assigned to the event is not the only possible meaning, and deliberately considering others, not to manipulate yourself into a better mood, but to arrive at a more accurate and therefore more useful understanding of what is actually happening. This practice has a specific and powerful application in conflict. When someone says something that stings, the automatic interpretation is almost always something personal. They are attacking me. They do not respect me. They think I am not good enough. They are trying to control me. And those interpretations, even when they feel absolutely certain, are often incomplete or skewed, or at minimum, only one of several possible readings of what was said. The person who criticized your idea might be anxious about a deadline, not contemptuous of your ability. The partner who went quiet might be overwhelmed, not punishing you. The colleague who did not acknowledge your contribution might have been distracted, not dismissive. This does not mean you should talk yourself out of every difficult feeling. Sometimes criticism is genuinely unfair. Sometimes people do dismiss you. Sometimes the relationship does have a real problem that needs to be addressed. Reframing is not about denying what is happening. It is about ensuring that what you believe is happening is based on evidence rather than assumption, and that before you respond, you have genuinely considered more than one interpretation of the events. The practice of reframing also changes something important over time. When you consistently practice asking what else might be true, you begin to develop what psychologists call cognitive flexibility. The ability to hold multiple interpretations of a situation simultaneously rather than becoming immediately and rigidly locked into the first one. And cognitive flexibility is one of the hallmarks of emotional maturity. It is what allows people to stay curious in conflict rather than becoming defensive, to listen even when they disagree, to say, "I might be missing something here," even when everything in them is certain they are not. And it is what allows relationships to grow rather than getting permanently stuck in the rigid grooves of reactive patterns. One of the most powerful reframes available in any emotionally charged situation is this one. Whatever the other person is doing, however hurtful or frustrating or unjust it might feel, they are doing it from their own pain, their own fear, their own history, their own unmet needs. This does not excuse harmful behavior. Not at all. But it places the behavior in a human context. And when you can see another person's difficult behavior as an expression of their own inner struggle rather than purely as an attack on you, the emotional charge shifts. You move from a posture of defense to a posture of, if not sympathy, at least understanding. And from understanding, a genuine response is far more possible than from defense. Chapter 10. Empathy as a regulation tool. There is a connection between empathy and emotional regulation that most people never make, because they think of these two things as entirely separate capacities. Empathy, in the common understanding, is about other people. It is the ability to understand and share the feelings of someone else. Regulation is about yourself. It is the ability to manage your own internal emotional states. And on the surface, these do indeed seem to point in different directions. One outward, one inward, one about them, one about you. But what the psychology of emotional intelligence reveals, when you look deeply enough, is that these two capacities are not separate at all. They are deeply, almost inseparably interconnected. And specifically, genuine empathy is one of the most powerful tools for self-regulation that exists, not despite being about other people, but because of it. Here is why this is true. When you are in a reactive emotional state, the primary characteristic of that state is that it is entirely self-centered, not in a morally negative sense, but in a literally physiological one. During an amygdala hijack, attention contracts. The field of awareness narrows dramatically to focus almost exclusively on your own experience, your own threat, your own hurt, your own anger, your own sense of injustice. The other person in the room, their experience, their feelings, their perspective, the context they might be coming from, all of this recedes. It becomes background noise at best, and at worst, it becomes fuel for the reaction. You see them not as a full human being with their own complicated interior world, but as the source of your discomfort. Empathy, practiced deliberately in that moment, does something that breathing alone cannot always do. It forces the expansion of your attention outward. It requires you to consider the other person as a person. And that act of consideration, that moment of genuinely asking, what might this person be feeling right now? What might be going on for them? What need might be driving what they are doing? Is not just compassionate, it is physiologically regulating. Because the moment your attention genuinely shifts from exclusively your own experience to include the experience of another human being, the amygdala's grip begins to loosen. The threat narrows. The nervous system registers that you are no longer in a pure survival situation but in a relational one. And relational situations are ones the prefrontal cortex is designed for. This is part of why staying connected to another person's humanity during conflict is so powerful. It is not just ethically admirable. It is neurologically self-protective. Empathy comes in several forms, and understanding them all gives you more precision in how to use this capacity as a regulatory tool. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand someone else's perspective intellectually, to take their viewpoint, to follow the logic of why they see the situation the way they do, even when you do not agree with it. This form of empathy does not require you to feel what they feel. It requires you to think clearly enough about their position to grasp it. And in a heated moment, cognitive empathy is often the most accessible entry point, because it does not demand that you immediately feel warmth or compassion for someone who has just done something that hurt you. It simply asks you to understand, Emotional empathy is the ability to actually feel what another person is feeling, to resonate with their emotional state as if it were also occurring in you. This form of empathy is deeper and more connecting, but it requires a certain degree of your own regulation first. Because if you are flooded with your own emotions, you cannot genuinely feel your way into someone else's experience. This is why self-regulation and empathy are mutually reinforcing. The calmer you are, the more access you have to genuine emotional empathy. And the more you exercise emotional empathy, the more regulated you tend to stay, because it pulls you out of the narrow tunnel of your own reactivity and into the wider space of shared human experience. Compassionate empathy goes one step further still. It is not just understanding or feeling, but the active desire to help, to respond to what the other person is experiencing in a way that is actually useful to them. And compassionate empathy in a difficult conversation means asking yourself, not just what am I feeling, but what does this person actually need right now? Not what do I need to say to defend myself or make my point, but what does the situation call for from me, given what this person is going through? That question, what does this person actually need right now, is one of the most regulating questions you can ask yourself in a charged interaction, because it immediately repositions you. It takes you from a reactive posture, where the implicit question is what is being done to me, to a responsive posture, where the question is what can I do with this? It does not require you to abandon your own needs or to pretend the hurt is not there. It simply creates enough space that you can be both aware of your own experience and aware of the other person's simultaneously. And that dual awareness is, in itself, a profound act of emotional regulation. One of the most important things to understand about empathy as a regulatory tool is that it is not passive. It is not simply listening without responding. It is an active, deliberate orientation toward another person's inner world. And, like all skills, it develops with practice. The more consistently you practice taking another person's perspective before you respond, the more naturally it begins to occur. The more often you ask, what might they be feeling? The faster that question arises automatically, even in moments of conflict. And the more access you have to that question in those moments, the less reactive you tend to be. Because the other person becomes real to you in a way that makes it genuinely harder to simply discharge your emotion in their direction. Empathy also does something to the dynamic of a conversation that nothing else quite replicates. When someone feels genuinely understood, their own nervous system tends to de-escalate. Not always immediately, not in every situation, but as a general pattern, being met with genuine empathy softens people. It reduces the threat their system perceives. It signals safety. And safety is the precondition for the kind of honest, meaningful, productive conversation that both people in a conflict actually want, even if the reactive versions of them are currently making that seem impossible. The person who can regulate themselves through empathy, who can stay curious about another person's experience even when they are hurting, who can ask what might be going on for you, rather than defaulting immediately to what you did to me, that person has access to a quality of relationship that most people only glimpse occasionally. A quality of depth and trust and mutual understanding that is built precisely in the difficult moments, not despite them. And the capacity to create that, to be that kind of presence for another human being, even when you yourself are in the middle of something difficult, is perhaps the highest expression of what emotional intelligence can become. Chapter 11. Emotional Regulation at Work. Work is where most people are tested the hardest, not because the stakes are always higher than in personal life, though sometimes they are, but because the professional environment combines two things that make emotional regulation extraordinarily difficult. It asks you to perform at a high level while simultaneously navigating a dense web of other people's personalities, insecurities, ambitions, communication styles, and unspoken needs, all inside a structure where power dynamics shape nearly every interaction. You are expected to be professional, which is often misread as emotionless, while also being effective, which requires the full engagement of your emotional intelligence. It is a contradiction that very few workplaces ever help their people understand, let alone resolve. And the result is that most professional environments are quietly full of people reacting in ways large and small, every single day. Consider what the average workday actually contains from a purely emotional standpoint. A colleague dismisses your idea in a meeting without engaging with it seriously. A manager gives you feedback in a tone that feels more like contempt than guidance. A deadline gets moved up without any acknowledgement of the additional pressure that creates for you and your team. A promotion goes to someone else, and no one offers an explanation. A client responds coldly to something you spent real effort on. A teammate takes credit in a way that feels like it erased your contribution entirely. None of these are catastrophic events in isolation. None of them are the kind of thing most people would describe as a serious problem worth addressing. But each one generates a real emotional response. A flicker of shame, a surge of frustration, a quiet burn of resentment, a dull ache of disappointment. And if those responses are not processed, not acknowledged, and released, they accumulate. They color the next interaction and the one after that, until the emotional backlog is so heavy that something completely ordinary finally triggers a reaction that looks entirely out of proportion to anyone watching, but makes complete sense to the person experiencing it. Emotional regulation at work begins with understanding that this accumulation is the real enemy. Not any single difficult moment, but the pattern of unprocessed emotional responses that builds up over time and steadily narrows your capacity for clear thinking, genuine empathy, and effective communication. The most important thing you can do in a professional context is not learn to suppress your reactions in any given moment. It is to develop practices that process what you feel consistently enough that you never carry more than the present moment requires. Consider the challenge of receiving criticism at work. Few things trigger the reactive state faster in a professional setting, because criticism in the workplace does not only carry the surface-level message about the quality of the work itself. It carries deeper implications, consciously or not, about your competence, your value, and your belonging in that organization. When a manager says your analysis missed the key point, the amygdala can hear something far more threatening than feedback about a document. It can hear, "You are not adequate for this role," or "You do not belong here." That misread is what produces the defensive response, the impulse to justify, to explain, to push back, to prove that the criticism is wrong, even when some part of you knows there is real truth in it. The regulated response to criticism is not easy, but it is simple in its structure. It requires catching the surge of defensiveness before it becomes a verbal response. taking the physical breath that interrupts the stress cascade, and then making a deliberate shift in how you are framing the moment. The manager is not saying you are worthless. They are saying the analysis has a gap. Those are entirely different statements. And in a calm state, you know that clearly. But in the reactive state, the amygdala collapses the distance between them and you. Respond as though you have been personally attacked, even when you have simply been given information that could make your work better. A genuinely regulated response to professional criticism sounds something like this. It pauses. It listens until the other person has fully finished speaking. It does not interrupt to defend or to explain. It asks a clarifying question if needed, not to challenge but to genuinely understand what the other person is pointing to. And then it says something that acknowledges the feedback without self-erasure. Something like, "That is helpful to know. Let me sit with that and come back to you." That response requires exactly the same three things every genuine response requires: the pause, the breath, the reframe. But the professional context adds a fourth element, which is the recognition that how you handle criticism in a visible moment determines how people see you in all the invisible ones that follow. Leaders are not people who never feel the sting of criticism. They are people who have learned not to make their sting everyone else's problem. The management of conflict between colleagues is another territory where emotional regulation separates the people who advance from those who stagnate. Workplace conflict almost always begins not as a conflict about the work itself, but as a conflict about feeling unheard, undervalued, disrespected, or dismissed. The content, the disagreement about the project direction or the process or the resource allocation, is always the surface. Underneath it is nearly always an emotional experience that one or both parties have not been able to articulate. And so, instead of talking about what they actually feel, they fight about what they think. And the fight about what they think almost never resolves the feeling underneath it, which is why workplace conflicts have a way of recurring in slightly different forms indefinitely, until the underlying emotional reality is finally addressed. The emotionally regulated person in a conflict with a colleague does something unusual and genuinely powerful. They get curious before they get adversarial. Instead of building their case and waiting for the other person to stop talking so they can deploy it, they actually listen. They try to understand what the other person is protecting, what need is underneath the position they are holding. Because every position in a conflict is a protection of a need. And once you can see the need, the position becomes far less of an obstacle. You are no longer arguing about two incompatible solutions. You are looking together for one solution that honors both sets of underlying needs. That conversation is incomparably more productive and far less destructive to the relationship and the broader working environment than the argument about who is right. There is also the question of emotional regulation under deadline pressure, which is its own particular kind of test, and one that most people in professional life encounter with painful regularity. When time is short and stakes are high, the nervous system treats the situation as an emergency. In evolutionary terms, urgency and danger are closely related. Cortisol rises. Thinking narrows. The temptation to push people too hard, to skip steps that matter, to communicate with a sharpness that would be unacceptable in a calmer moment. All of this intensifies. And in those moments, the most important thing a person with emotional intelligence can do is slow down slightly rather than speeding up. Take 30 seconds before sending the email that feels urgent. Take one full breath before speaking in the high-pressure meeting. Because the decisions and communications made in a reactive state under pressure are almost always the ones that require the most repair afterward. The apologies offered later, the clarifications needed, the trust rebuilt. All of that costs more time and more energy than the 30-second pause would have. The long-term rewards of emotional regulation in professional life are not small or abstract. They are concrete, visible, and compounding. People who regulate well are trusted more. Because trust is built fundamentally on predictability and safety. And a regulated person is both more predictable and safer to be around than a reactive one. They are given more responsibility. Because leaders who have to manage the emotional fallout of someone's reactivity quickly learn to route important work away from that person. They build better professional relationships, which research consistently shows to be the single most powerful driver of long-term career success in nearly every field and context. And perhaps most significantly, they create working environments around them that reflect their own emotional quality. A regulated manager creates a team that feels psychologically safe enough to take risks, admit mistakes without fear, and bring their best thinking to every challenge. And teams operating in that environment consistently produce better work, with less drama, more creativity, and more loyalty than teams operating under the weight of fear and reactive leadership. The investment in emotional regulation at work is not just personal development. It is an organizational force multiplier. And it starts with one person deciding to do it differently. Chapter 12. Emotional regulation in relationships. If the workplace tests your emotional regulation through the complexity of performance and hierarchy and professional stakes, intimate relationships test it through something both simpler and far deeper. They test it through the fundamental human vulnerability of being truly known by another person. Because in a close relationship, whether that is a romantic partnership, a deep friendship, or any bond where two people have let each other pass the social surface, the other person has access to your most sensitive places. They know where you are insecure. They know what you fear. They know the things you have never quite said out loud, but that are legible in your behavior if you look closely enough. They have seen you at your worst, not just in the ordinary, imperfect moments, but in the real ones. The ones that cost you something to be seen in. And because they carry all of that knowledge, their words and their actions land differently than anyone else's words and actions. They go deeper. They matter more. And when they hurt in a way that nothing from the outside world can quite replicate. This is why intimate relationships are simultaneously the arena where emotional regulation is most needed and the arena where it is hardest to maintain. The closer someone is to you, the more precisely their behavior can touch your deepest triggers. And the more activated your triggers are, the more you are responding not to the person in front of you, but to the accumulated weight of everything that person has ever said or done that felt like this moment, and everything from your earlier life that felt like this, and everything you are most afraid of feeling again. The reaction in a close relationship is rarely only about today. It is almost always also about yesterday and last month and 3 years ago and something that happened before the relationship even began. The most common pattern that destroys closeness in intimate relationships is not dramatic cruelty or obvious betrayal. It is the everyday accumulation of reactive exchanges that never get fully resolved and never fully dissipate. One partner says something thoughtless, the other reacts defensively. The first becomes defensive in return. Neither of them actually says what they meant. Neither of them actually hears what the other person needed. The moment passes, maybe after a tense silence or an apology that does not quite reach the source of the hurt, but the emotional residue of it stays. And the next time something similar happens, there is a little more charge, a little less patience, a little more distance built into the interaction before it even begins. Over time, the reactive pattern becomes the dominant pattern of the relationship, and the two people who once felt profoundly understood by each other begin to feel profoundly alone inside what looks from the outside like a functioning relationship. Emotional regulation in relationships is the practice of interrupting that pattern, not once as a dramatic decision to become a different person, but consistently in the ordinary daily moments where the pattern wants to reassert itself in the small ways that no one would even call a fight, but that erode connection one small withdrawal at a time. One of the most important things to understand about regulating in a close relationship is that the goal is never to win the argument. The goal is always to protect the relationship while honoring the truth, which means honoring your own experience without making it the other person's fault. These two things feel like they are in direct conflict when you are in the reactive state. In a reactive state, the truth feels like it requires being delivered loudly, sharply, immediately, and in a way that leaves the other person with no doubt that they were wrong. But truth delivered that way almost never lands as truth. It lands as attack, and the other person, now in their own reactive state, hears not the content of what you said, but the emotional force behind how you said it. They respond to the force, and now neither of you is having the conversation you needed to have. You are having a completely different conversation that neither of you wanted or agreed to. The regulated approach to truth-telling in a close relationship is slower, softer, and counterintuitively more powerful. It waits for a moment when both people are calm enough to actually hear each other. It begins not with the other person's behavior, but with the speaker's own experience, using what relationship researchers call first-person language. Not, "you never listen to me," which is an accusation that instantly triggers defensiveness in almost any recipient. But when I feel like I am not being heard, something inside me starts to close, and I want so much for us to fix that between us. The difference between those two sentences is not merely stylistic. It is structural. It is the difference between positioning the other person as the problem and positioning the disconnection as the problem, and inviting the other person to be part of the solution. The first sentence creates two sides. The second creates a shared project. This kind of communication requires emotional regulation at the exact moment it is hardest to maintain, which is when you are already hurting. Speaking from genuine hurt without weaponizing it requires you to be simultaneously fully in contact with your own pain and sufficiently regulated not to discharge it at the other person. That is genuinely one of the hardest things a human being can practice. It is the kind of hard that most people would rather avoid by either saying nothing and accumulating resentment, or saying too much and doing damage. They then spend weeks trying to repair. But the relationships that last, the ones that deepen rather than deteriorate over the long arc of time, are built in exactly those difficult moments when one or both people made the harder choice, when they chose the regulated response over the reactive one, not because it was easy, but because they valued the relationship more than they valued the momentary satisfaction of discharging their emotion. Emotional regulation in relationships also means learning to stay present with a partner's difficult emotions without immediately trying to fix them or being activated by them. When someone you love is in distress, it can trigger anxiety in you about your own adequacy, your own responsibility, your own need to make the discomfort stop. And when you react to their emotion by trying to fix it before it has been fully felt, what they experience is not comfort, but a kind of dismissal. They needed to be witnessed. They got a solution. Genuine emotional presence in a close relationship means being able to hold space for the other person's experience without either running from it or merging with it. It means offering a regulated, warm, genuinely attentive presence, which is the thing that hurting people need most, and which is only available from someone who has done enough of their own inner work to be truly steady. The relationships that model emotional intelligence in their fullest expression are not relationships without conflict. They have plenty of conflict, because conflict is simply what happens when two different human beings want or feel different things at the same time. And two different human beings always will. But the conflicts are had differently. They are had with a shared commitment to resolution rather than winning. They are had with the understanding that the other person is not the enemy, even when they are the source of the discomfort. They are had and then genuinely finished, without the accumulated resentment and silent scorekeeping that turns individual conflicts into a slow war of attrition. And over time, the consistent practice of regulating through conflict rather than reacting through it builds something that ordinary relationships almost never reach. It builds the particular kind of trust that comes from knowing that even when things are hard between you, the other person is going to stay present, stay honest, and stay committed to finding the way through together. That trust is not built in the easy moments. It is built entirely and only in the hard ones. Chapter 13. Emotional regulation with family. Family is its own category. It deserves its own chapter. Not because the principles of emotional regulation work differently here, but because the emotional terrain is different in ways that are profound and that matter enormously to how you actually apply everything you have learned. Family relationships carry a weight and a history that no other relationships carry. They are the original environment in which your emotional patterns were first formed. They are where your deepest triggers were created. They are where the neural pathways that still fire in your reactive moments were first laid down. And they are, for most people, the relationships where they are most likely to revert to their oldest, least developed version of themselves, regardless of how much genuine growth they may have achieved in every other area of their lives. You have probably experienced this. You spend months or years working on yourself. You develop your self-awareness. You practice the pause. You get meaningfully better at regulating in professional settings. You even start responding more skillfully in your intimate relationships. And then you go home for a family gathering. And within 20 minutes, you are somehow 14 years old again. The dynamic you thought you had outgrown reasserts itself with a force that feels almost physical. A parent makes a comment that should be easy to let pass. And instead, it hits like a dart aimed at something very specific inside you. A sibling says something familiar, something they have been saying in some form for your entire shared life, and you feel a surge of feeling that is completely disproportionate to the words themselves, but makes absolute emotional sense to the part of you that remembers every time those words or words like them arrived. You react in a way you thought you were past. And then you spend the drive home wondering what happened to all the work you thought you had done. and whether it means anything at all. What happened is simply that family triggers are the oldest triggers you carry. They were formed earliest, when you were most vulnerable, before you had any of the tools you now possess. They have the deepest and most well-established neural grooves in the entire architecture of your emotional patterns. They are the most consistent, the most well-rehearsed, the most automatic of any conditioned response in your life. And the family system itself has been running the same dynamic for decades in many cases. Every member has an assigned role, a set of expected behaviors, a familiar emotional script that was written long before any of you were consciously aware of it. The moment you walk back into the system pulls on you to play your part. Not out of malice, out of familiarity, out of the deeply human tendency to recreate what is known, even when what is known is limiting you and everyone else in the room. Emotional regulation within the family context requires something that does not come up in any other area of this work quite so pointedly, and that is grief. Because to genuinely change your patterns within your family, to stop playing the role you have always played and start showing up as the regulated, conscious, freely choosing adult you are becoming, you have to allow yourself to grieve something. You have to let go of the hope that the family will suddenly change to match your growth, or that the parent who was too critical will finally offer the unconditional validation you needed as a child, or that the sibling who always competed will suddenly become your most enthusiastic supporter, or that the old hurt will somehow retroactively be healed by a new conversation. These things may happen in limited forms. They rarely happen in the full way you might imagine them. And staying secretly attached to the hope that they will keeps you perpetually in the position of the child waiting for the parent to be different, rather than the adult, choosing how to show up, regardless of what the parent does. This acceptance is not defeat. It is not resignation. It is liberation in the truest sense of the word. Because the moment you stop waiting for the family to become something different before you can feel okay in their presence, the moment you stop reacting from the wound of what they are not, you free yourself to respond from who you actually are. You can be in the room with the critical parent without requiring them to change their approach before you are allowed to feel grounded. You can hear the familiar comment from the sibling without it pulling you back into the old competition or the old shame. Not because it no longer stings, but because you have developed enough internal steadiness that the sting is information rather than instruction. You can feel it, acknowledge it honestly and internally, and still choose a response that reflects your actual values rather than your oldest and least sophisticated wound. The specific techniques for regulating in family settings draw on everything from the earlier chapters, but they require a few particular emphases given the unique power of this terrain. First, preparation matters more here than anywhere else. Before a family gathering or a difficult conversation with a family member, you spend time setting a genuine intention about how you want to show up. You remind yourself, concretely, of the person you are working to become, not the person you default to becoming when the old patterns activate. You identify which triggers are likely to appear because you know your family's patterns by now, and you prepare yourself to see them coming rather than being blindsided by them. You decide in advance how you will respond if the comment you always dread is made. Not by scripting every word, but by deciding the spirit in which you will engage. This is not pessimism about your family. It is intelligent self-knowledge applied proactively, which is one of the most sophisticated things emotional intelligence can do. Second, physical regulation is especially critical in family settings, precisely because the triggers are so old and so deeply embedded that they can activate a full physiological stress response before your conscious mind has even registered what was said. Keeping your breathing slow and deliberate throughout a family interaction, staying physically grounded through posture and the felt sense of your own body in the chair or on the couch, noticing the contact between your feet and the floor. These are not background activities in this context. They are the primary regulatory work. They keep your nervous system at a baseline where the prefrontal cortex remains sufficiently online to give you actual choices about how to respond, rather than simply running the old automatic program. Third, and perhaps most importantly, lower your expectations of perfection from yourself in this arena. You are going to react sometimes. You are going to say something you immediately wish you could take back. You are going to feel the old pull of the old role and go with it, at least partially, especially in the beginning of this work. This does not mean you have failed. It does not mean the work is not working. It means you are human, navigating what is genuinely the most challenging emotional environment most people ever inhabit. What matters is not that you are perfect in the family context, but that you are incrementally better, that the reaction you had today was slightly less intense, or resolved more quickly, or was followed by a more honest repair than the one you had at the last gathering. That is not nothing. That is growth happening in one of the most difficult emotional environments on Earth. And finally, there is something worth acknowledging about what you model within your family system when you begin to regulate consistently. You cannot force the system to change by willing it or demanding it, but you can introduce a new variable into it, which is your own changed behavior. And because systems are interconnected, a genuine change in one element begins, over time, to affect all the others. The parent who used to reliably provoke a reactive response from you and now consistently meets something different, something warm and present and not taking the familiar bait, that parent's behavior often begins to shift in subtle ways over time, not always dramatically, not always even consciously on their part, but the system responds to the new input. Family patterns are not your destiny. They are learned behaviors that were layered into you by an environment you had no control over. And learned behaviors, even ones as old and as deep as these, can be interrupted and gradually replaced by something you choose consciously. Starting now, in the next moment, the old pattern would have run itself and didn't. Chapter 14. What emotionally intelligent people do differently. It is worth pausing at this point in the journey to look at the whole picture clearly, to ask what it actually looks like in the lived texture of an ordinary day, to be a person who has genuinely and consistently developed emotional intelligence. Not a perfect person, because emotional intelligence has nothing to do with perfection and never will. Not a serene, untouched person who floats above the difficulties of ordinary human experience, always composed, never rattled, immune to the things that affect everyone else. That is not what regulation means. That is not what any of this work is building toward. What it builds is something more interesting and more real than that. A person who moves through the world differently than the majority of people do, in ways that are quiet enough to miss from the outside, but profound enough to change everything from the inside. Emotionally intelligent people feel everything. Let that land clearly, because it contradicts the most common misconception about what emotional intelligence is. They are not less sensitive than others. In fact, they are often more sensitive, more attuned, more aware of the emotional subtleties and undercurrents in themselves and in the rooms they walk into. The difference is not in the depth of the feeling. It is in the relationship they have with the feeling. They are not identified with their emotional states in the way that most reactive people are. When anger arises, they know they are experiencing anger. They do not become anger. When sadness comes, they can hold it, stay with it, understand what it is telling them, and let it move through rather than either stuffing it down or drowning in it. When anxiety spikes, they recognize it as a signal worth attending to, without treating it as a verdict on what is real. This witnessing capacity, this small but supremely important internal distance from their own emotional experience, is the thread running through everything they do differently. What does this look like in actual practice, in real interactions? On an ordinary day, emotionally intelligent people listen in a way that most people genuinely do not. Not the kind of listening that is really a form of waiting, where half of your attention is tracking the other person's words, and the other half is already formulating your rebuttal or planning your own story. Real listening. The kind where you set aside your internal monologue long enough to actually inhabit what the other person is trying to say. Where you are following not just the content of their words, but the emotional current running beneath them. Where you notice when someone's words and their tone are slightly out of alignment, when they say they are fine, but something in their posture or their pace or the quality of the silence after they speak tells a different story. Emotionally intelligent people catch those misalignments because their own internal emotional noise is regulated enough to leave room for attention to someone else. They speak with precision rather than with volume or velocity. Not more eloquently, necessarily, but more accurately. They have developed a larger and more differentiated emotional vocabulary because they have spent consistent time identifying and naming what they feel with specificity. And because they can identify their emotions precisely, they can communicate them without either suppressing them, which creates the pressure that eventually leaks out sideways, or discharging them indiscriminately, which is what happens when someone says things they immediately regret. When they are hurt, they can say, "I feel hurt," rather than either suffering in silence and building resentment or lashing out in a way that makes the other person feel attacked rather than informed. The precision of emotional language is a regulatory act in itself. It engages the prefrontal cortex. It reduces the intensity of the amygdala's firing, and it creates the conditions for genuine communication rather than mutual self-protection. Emotionally intelligent people hold their interpretations lightly. This is one of the most quietly radical things about them. They regularly examine their own reading of events and ask themselves, honestly, whether that reading is the only possible one, or whether it is the first one, the habitual one, the one their history generated automatically. They are willing to discover they were wrong about what someone meant, willing to find that the situation had dimensions they initially missed, willing to say, even internally, I might be seeing this through my own lens rather than seeing it clearly. This intellectual and emotional humility is not weakness. It does not make them pushovers or people who cannot hold a position. It makes them learners. And learners consistently navigate their lives better than people who insist on the accuracy of their first interpretation. They take full responsibility without collapsing into guilt, which is one of the most sophisticated emotional accomplishments available to a human being. When they do something that causes harm, when they react instead of respond, when they get it wrong in a conversation or a decision or a relationship moment, they own it, cleanly, specifically, without the excessive self-flagellation that turns an apology into a performance of suffering, and without the defensive justification that turns it into an explanation for why it was not really their fault. They name what they did. They acknowledge the impact. They express genuine intention about what they will do differently. And then they move forward. They do not carry their mistakes as evidence of their fundamental inadequacy. They carry them as information about the work that remains, which is a very different relationship with failure than the one most people have. They have developed a capacity for tolerating discomfort that changes the entire range of what they are willing to do and say and feel. They can sit with not knowing how something is going to turn out. They can tolerate someone being upset with them without immediately trying to make the discomfort stop through appeasement, withdrawal, or counterattack. They can hold the awkwardness of a difficult conversation all the way through to the other side, rather than ejecting from it before anything real has been said. They can stay in the uncertainty of a relationship going through a hard stretch without catastrophizing or numbing out. This tolerance for discomfort is not indifference. It is the earned capacity to remain present with what is difficult because they trust themselves not to be destroyed by it. And that trust changes what is possible for them in relationships, in professional life, and in their own inner experience. Finally, and perhaps most essentially, emotionally intelligent people are genuinely interested in other people, not in a performed way, not as people going through the social motions of interest, while remaining fundamentally self-focused, but with real and consistent curiosity about the interior worlds of the humans around them. They find other people fascinating. They want to know not just what someone thinks, but why they think it. Not just what someone feels, but where that feeling comes from. Not just what someone did, but what they were trying to protect or create or communicate. This curiosity is both a product of emotional intelligence and one of its most powerful generators. The more genuinely interested you are in another person, the more information you receive, the more you understand, and the more effective and more compassionate your responses become. At its deepest level, emotional intelligence is not a set of techniques. It is a fundamental orientation toward other people that says you matter, what you feel matters, and I am here to understand rather than to defend. Chapter 15. Who you become when you master this. There is something that happens to a person who commits genuinely, consistently, and over a long enough period of time to the work of emotional intelligence. Something that goes beyond skill acquisition and beyond the specific ways their relationships and their professional life measurably improve. Something changes at a deeper level than outcomes. It changes at the level of identity, at the level of who you are in your own experience. Not just when things are going well and the practicing is easy, but in the ordinary, unglamorous, unglamored daily experience of being yourself. This change is worth describing as clearly as possible, because it is the actual point of everything. It is the reason any of this matters in the first place. The person you are becoming through this work is someone who trusts themselves. That might sound modest when you first hear it. But for most people, genuine self-trust is anything but ordinary or easy. Because what makes emotional reactivity so costly is not only the external damage it produces, the relationships strained, the opportunities missed, the words that cannot be recalled. It is the damage it does to the relationship you have with yourself. Every time you react in a way you immediately regret, a small deposit is made into an internal account that tracks the distance between who you are and who you know you are capable of being. Over time, for people who react often and at significant intensity, that account accumulates a kind of emotional debt that begins to feel like evidence. Evidence that you cannot be trusted with your own interior life. Evidence that the reactive version of you is the real version, the true one, the one that always wins eventually. Evidence that the composed, caring, intentional person you sometimes manage to be is the exceptional case, and the explosion or the withdrawal or the bitter silence is the rule. This is one of the most painful stories a person can carry inside themselves, and it is fundamentally false. But it is incredibly convincing when you are living inside it, because the reactive moments are vivid and their consequences are unforgettable, while the regulated moments tend to pass without ceremony. Nobody notices the argument you didn't have. Nobody celebrates the comment you let go, the breath you took, the choice you made to stay present when every instinct was telling you to leave the room. The reactive moments get remembered because they leave marks. The regulated ones leave nothing visible, only a slowly deepening steadiness that you might not even notice, accumulating until one day you realize you are responding to situations that used to devastate you with something that feels remarkably close to equanimity. What emotional intelligence breaks? Through this accumulation, through these ordinary, invisible moments of regulated choice, repeated again and again, is the cycle of self-evidence. It replaces the account that says you cannot be trusted with a different account, one that says you can, not perfectly, not always, but consistently enough and increasingly enough that the old story about your own inadequacy begins to lose its credibility. It does not dissolve overnight. It does not evaporate after a single breakthrough moment. It fades through the weight of evidence to the contrary. Evidence produced by you, in your own life, in real interactions with real people, over real time. And as that self-trust deepens, the quality of your inner life changes in ways that are difficult to fully communicate but impossible to miss once you have begun to feel them. The most immediately noticeable is a reduction in a kind of exhaustion that you may not even have recognized as exhaustion, because it had been present so long it felt like your baseline. Reactivity is extraordinarily costly energetically. The constant, low-level vigilance of a nervous system that is never fully at rest. The energy consumed managing the aftermath of reactions, the apologies and explanations and repairs that reactive moments require. The mental weight of carrying regret and resentment, and all the things that were said and never resolved, and all the things that were never said but needed to be. When the reactive pattern loosens its grip, gradually but unmistakably, a space opens up in your daily experience that you had forgotten was even possible. Not the absence of emotion, not a flat or muted inner life, but the absence of the particular grinding strain that comes from being at war with yourself every day. There is also, for most people, a reduction in loneliness that surprises them because they did not identify their reactivity as something that was making them lonely. But reactivity is profoundly isolating in a very specific way. It keeps people at a managed, defended distance. It prevents the depth of connection that is only possible when both people feel genuinely safe to be fully, imperfectly, honestly themselves in the presence of the other. Emotional regulation does the opposite. When others experience you as someone who listens without immediate defensiveness, who speaks without cruelty even in difficult moments, who stays present with what is hard rather than pulling away or shutting down. They extend trust in return. They bring more of themselves to you. The conversations get deeper. The understanding gets more specific and more real. And the quality of your relationships shifts in a way that nothing else can produce, and that feeds something in you that used to go consistently hungry. There is also a quality of freedom that opens up. This one might be the most surprising of all. Reactivity feels like power in the moment. The loudness of the anger, the cold finality of the withdrawal, the precision of a sharp word, all of these can feel in the instant they occur like something assertive, something strong, something that makes a point that could not otherwise be made. But reactivity is actually one of the most constrained ways to live. Because when your behavior is determined by your triggers, you are not making choices. You are running programs. The anger was not something you chose from a range of options. The withdrawal was not a decision you made after considering the alternatives. The sharp word was not carefully selected from a set of possible responses. You were pulled. The trigger fired. The old program ran, and the behavior appeared. And when you are being pulled, when the behavior is running you, rather than you directing the behavior, there is no freedom in that at all, regardless of how much force it contains. Genuine freedom, in the psychological and human sense, is exactly what we described at the very beginning of this journey. It is the freedom that lives in the space between what happens and what you do next. The freedom to choose who you are in each moment, rather than being automatically delivered to a version of yourself that was decided for you by your history and your wounds and your oldest conditioning. And that freedom, once you begin to genuinely inhabit it, once it becomes not a concept you understand intellectually, but an experience you recognize in your own body, as the pause lands and the breath happens, and the response comes from somewhere clearer and truer than the reaction would have, that freedom becomes something you will not trade away, not for the momentary release of the reaction, not for the temporary sense of power in the discharge, not for any of the short-term payoffs that kept the reactive pattern in place for so long. Who you become when you master emotional intelligence is not a softer version of yourself, and it is not a more controlled version, and it is not a version that has somehow managed to extract the difficulty from being human. It is a more honest version, a more fully realized version, a version that knows its own triggers and works with them as information rather than being blindsided and driven by them. A version that can feel the full range of what is available to feel in a human life without being governed by any single emotion. A version that brings genuine, regulated, curious presence to its relationships rather than the defended, managed, somewhat behind-glass presence that reactivity produces. A version that can hear hard things without collapsing and say hard things without cruelty. A version that trusts itself enough to be fully vulnerable in the right moments and is grounded enough to stay clear under real pressure. That version of you has always existed. It was present before the conditioning layered over it. It was there before the triggers were installed and the reactive patterns were reinforced. It is what you were before life taught you that certain emotions were too dangerous to express, that certain needs were too likely to be unmet to be worth naming, that the only safe responses were the ones that protected you from whatever you most feared. The work of emotional intelligence is not the work of building yourself into something you have never been. It is the work of uncovering someone who has always been there, underneath the layers, waiting for the conditions to emerge, waiting for the awareness that sees what is actually happening, waiting for the tools to work with what is seen, waiting for the practice that turns the tools into second nature, and waiting for the courage that shows up not in dramatic moments of decision, but in the small, private, unremarkable instant when you feel the pull of the old pattern and choose, quietly and deliberately, to do something different. You have the awareness now. You have the tools. The practice is what remains. And the practice does not begin in some imagined future, when circumstances are calmer or the stakes are lower or you feel more ready. It begins in the next conversation. In the next moment, someone says something that activates that familiar feeling. In the next time you feel the pull of the reaction and you recognize it for what it is. An old program, not your truth, not your destiny, just a habit, and one that can be changed. It begins in the breath you are about to take. That single, conscious, deliberately chosen breath that carries with it a message your whole nervous system can hear. I am here. I am present. I am more than this reaction. And I am choosing something that reflects who I actually am. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. And it is available to you right now.